This episode of Harvey Brownstone Interviews is brought to you by the Harvey Brownstone Talk Show Blend Coffee, available at hollywoodblends.com. Everyone's saying it's the best coffee they've ever tasted. Why not give it a try and see for yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Harvey Brownstone, and as many of you know, we have featured a number of authors on our show who've written books about surviving the Holocaust. Today's guest has produced a highly compelling and emotionally powerful book that came into existence in a rather unusual way. When her father, Wolf Schwersenz, was an 11-year-old child living with his parents in Nazi Germany and suffering horrific antisemitic persecution, as all European Jews did after the rise of Hitler, the family overcame every conceivable obstacle and narrowly escaped deportation and death in 1941 by miraculously finding a way to get to America. When Wolf turned 75, he wrote his life story entitled The History of My Life's Struggles, vividly retelling and preserving his memories of his childhood in Nazi Germany, his family's death-defying escape from Europe, the arduous and horrific 5-week journey across the Atlantic in an unspeakably ill-equipped and dangerously overcrowded cargo ship, and the sometimes painful and challenging transition to life in America for himself, his parents, and his sister as new immigrants. He also wrote about his fascinating experiences as an intelligence officer in the American military when he was sent back to East Germany in the 1950s. 12 years after Wolf wrote his life story, and after he passed away in 2018, his daughter, our guest, found her father's 340-page notes in her attic. And she carefully and lovingly converted those notes into a book entitled American Wolf, From Nazi Refugee to American Spy, telling her father's story through his voice. It's a riveting, heart-stopping, true story full of last-minute rescues, near-death encounters, and survival against untold odds. It's also a story about survival, tenacity, ingenuity, family dynamics, inherited trauma, and national identity. And above all, it's a resounding testament to the triumph of the human spirit. Our guest is from New York, and she recently retired from a distinguished career as a doctor specializing in pediatric gastroenterology. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Audrey Birnbaum to our show. Dr. Birnbaum, thank you so much for being here.
Harvey, thank you so much for having me amongst your illustrious guests. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you also for that wonderful synopsis.
Audrey, is it okay if I call you Audrey?
Yes, please. I'm always going to be a doctor, but the title can remain behind me. Thank you.
I want to start by asking you why your father never published the book himself.
You know, I think when he wrote it, he meant it really to be for his family, like his grandchildren, that the memory of the story would go on. He did want it to be published, and I think that he thought that in the way that he wrote it, it was publishable. When I read it and found it, which was shortly after he died, when we were trying to search for like what the true story was of his past, I read it and I really had a hard time getting through it, to be honest. It was very detailed, which was wonderful, and it gave me a great template for what I needed to write, but it was dry, I guess would be the way I would put it, and sort of lacking in emotion, which is hard to imagine, but true. So the elements were there, but it might have been okay, let's say, for like the Holocaust Museum is just, a factual account.
Well, what made you decide to turn his notes into a book?
I think, again, I felt like because he wanted it to be published, and I knew that that was his goal, I felt like I owed it to him to finish the job. And then I also did think that it was a story that was really worth telling. It was really riveting. I mean, when I read it, there was a feeling that I had of wondering, like, would he get out of Germany, which of course is kind of a silly thing to think when I knew that I was alive. So I knew he made it out. But there was that sense of, sort of with all the obstacles he had encountered, to wonder how would they do it? How was it possible? Every step of the way, there was a letdown of, and just one thing after the other, that there was just, it just seemed like every obstacle was put in their path almost intentionally. And so it was a story to be told. And then I felt like there was this other piece of it too, which was once they came to this country, that the story wasn't over. And I felt like that was a story that hadn't really been told either. What happens to the immigrant when they're displaced? So it was like three stories in one. It was getting out of Germany at the last minute, 1941. The war had already broken out. It was coming here and what happens when everything's been taken from you. And then it was the return to Germany, which was such a full circle as a spy and returning. What does that mean to your identity?
When you sat down and read your father's notes, Audrey, were you surprised by what he wrote, or were you already familiar with the details of his life story?
And my sister and I have gone over that so many times because we felt on the one hand, we had grown up with the Holocaust, like it was in our blood. We had been watching Holocaust documentaries from a ridiculously young age, like 5, 6. I remember seeing, the Shoah, all of it, in a way that was almost like, I felt like traumatic to us. We knew my father, he wasn't shy about telling us stories, but they were like individual stories. The train ride or the boat ride, or they were told us when we were so young that by the time we got older, we stopped hearing them because it was sort of assumed that we knew. And then when he passed away and I had to prepare his eulogy, I realized that the details were completely gone. And we were sitting there saying, "Oh, did he leave Spain? Did he leave Portugal?" We didn't really know. What boat was it? There was a lot of missing details. And that's when I realized that we just didn't have the facts. And that's when this sort of discovery of this thing monumental thing he had written from memory. He had not kept contemporaneous notes, but I just found out recently, my mother said that the reason he's put pen to paper, or in fact typed with 2 index fingers, was that he had been diagnosed with prostate cancer at around that time that he wrote, and he really thought he might succumb to it. So he said, "I better write this down." And he took months to just sort of relive everything. So when we found it and found all the details, we kind of found all these facts that we really didn't know, didn't remember. I couldn't tell you whether he had told it to all of us, to us before. But what I definitely learned much more than I ever knew.
How much supplementary research and writing did you have to do to flesh out the story?
A lot. I did a lot of genealogy. I found relatives that I never knew we had, because my father and his somewhat dysfunctional mother had broken ties with a lot of people over the course of the years, which is a very important piece of the book, because it led to a lot of estrangements and created further difficulties for them as they came here. There was some misinformation because he was a child, so he misinterpreted things. And I don't think he really questioned some of those things when he arrived. How did it come about, that they were able to board a ship without proper documentation? Their visas had expired. How did that happen? The sense that they were being bombed every day. Was that true? So I definitely had to do the research. Or he had said some things about, he was in Seville at one point as part of their journey. Where was the location of certain things? And I had to really recreate that and fact check a lot of things that I took for granted were true and were not. So there was a lot of fact checking, although again, I'm not a historian, so I wasn't pretending to be one, but yes, there was a lot of fact checking. And in the process, I found a second cousin, and she lives a block and a half from my son in Chicago, which was amazing. What are the odds? It was amazing. It was truly amazing.
You wrote that your father's Holocaust trauma was not only a source of pain and suffering, it was also a point of pride. What did you mean by that?
That is an interesting question that I can only try to answer as a non-psychologist. But I felt like he would often be proud of being a German and be a little bit proud, like to tell his story to other people about being a survivor. He would almost tell it to anybody who would ask, almost to the point where my mother would be embarrassed, like, oh no, not another, no, don't start the story. And I thought, well, how is it that so many people who are survivors don't want to talk about it? And my father would talk about it so much. And I thought there's a term in psychology called like reaction formation. It's a little bit of a flipping of the switch, where something that you're almost ashamed of, you kind of turn it around and make it like a something that you kind of like puff up a little bit. Think about being, first you're reviled for being Jewish. And then you come to this country and people can't stand that you're German because they hate the Germans because we're at war with them. And they're not so thrilled with you being Jewish either because there's anti-Semitism too. And then there are the Eastern European Jews who don't like the German Jews because they say you're stuck up. So you're not liked for that either. And your whole life, you're really, again, reviled for who you are. Then my father met my mother, and her parents couldn't stand him because he was a foreigner and they were American. And just, how do you deal with that? Except to then, again, flip the switch and say instead, no, I'm so proud of who I am. I'm so proud I'm a German. But at first, it wasn't like that. Again, just weeks ago, my mother said that when she met my father, somebody asked her, I was at a book talk, and somebody asked my mother, I put her on the stage. She's 88. She did a great job. And they said, when did you find out about your husband's history? And she said, when she met him, he didn't tell her that he was a survivor. And he said that he learned German in the army. He lied to her. So I think that tells a lot about how he really felt about his history back then. But somehow he converted it to something that he, was a source of, made him different and important.
Now, I'm not going to go into detail about how your dad and his parents got out of Germany because I want people to read that for themselves in the book. But I will say that besides your father, the most intriguing character in the book is his mother, Greta. He described her as ambitious, driven, strict, and neurotic, and with a lot of inner rage. But he said she had incredible focus and determination, and it was that determination which ultimately saved his life. Now, Audrey, you were only 15 years old when she died. What are your memories of her?
So I think the way I would answer that is that this book is 100% true. It's based on all my father's notes, but it is subject to my interpretation in the sense that my father revered his mother. And although he would describe in the book the way that she sometimes was abusive to her daughter and describe the fights that she had with her husband, who she always felt was a little bit beneath her, he still did not objectively see her the way that you just mentioned her. So those are my words. In terms of seeing her a little bit more distantly, for the judgmental person and the tight, neurotic person. He would never have said, my mother is neurotic. I could see that from the way that he wrote her, but he would never have been able to describe her that way. Does that sort of make sense? So there's a merging of voices in this book, a merging of my adult ability to see what happened from a distance while using all of his material and honoring it and being true to it. But yes, my father had two parents, one who was a bit of a, can I say schlemiel? I don't know if that's the right word, like his father who was like a bit of a dreamer, a bit of a clown, and his mother who was driven, working, always working, but also kind of like a little sour, dour, sour, whatever. And the two were perfect complements for each other. And it made for a maybe not so pleasant home life, and yet it was critical, like, for her to be so perseverant, to go back and forth to the consulate and get the papers and do the work and get the tickets or whatever it was, and then to keep spirits up and do crazy things on my grandfather's side, some crazy stuff to avoid dying. You had to be a little crazy to do things to avoid, being taken away. And so it was, and also I think to create a sense of adventure for my father. Like he had some sense that this was an adventure and it could have been his age, but there's a part of me that thinks that maybe my grandfather kept that sense of, this is one big great adventure. Because that's sort of how it read to me.
One of the most interesting aspects of the book, Audrey, is the perception and attitude towards the Nazi regime among the German Jews during the late 30s. In 1934, your grandmother's cousin Siegfried, who was a judge, was fired, like all Jewish civil servants, so he and his family moved to Palestine. A number of other Jewish professionals left Germany throughout the late 30s, but your father described his parents as being, and I'm quoting him here, in a happy state of denial bordering on delusion about what was happening to the Jews and just how bad it would get. Did he feel that his parents ought to have seen the writing on the wall and gotten the family out of Germany sooner?
I think that he recognized that they had stayed too late, but I felt like I could see how it happened, and I think a lot of people fell victim to this. I mean, there was a combination of things. First of all, there were rabbis who were definitely saying, stay, be good citizens. If you just behave, it'll all pass over. There was constantly this talk of this will pass. There was also this lull. Everybody got really nervous after 1935, the race law, the Nuremberg race laws. There was a bit of a panic. A lot of people left after that. But then the Olympics came. And during 1936, there was this lull in anti-Jewish rhetoric. And it was because the public eye was on the Olympics. And I think my grandparents were lulled into that sort of state. And they didn't want to go. And there was a big, point I made in the book about how they had worked so hard to get there, to make it to the middle class, to establish roots, to build a business, and to give it all up was very hard. And businesses were the last to go. But the professions, if people lost their job, they had to go. They didn't have a source of money. But my family, were actually benefiting from people leaving, and they were able to sort of establish, what business they were there. It was helping them. So they were like, why would we go now? We're doing even better than we ever have. And so they were just planting their roots even deeper, financially. And so they missed the writing on the walls.
Well, I think this whole question of why so many Jews didn't see the Holocaust coming is very unfair, because we're looking at it in hindsight with 2020 vision. But your father, as you mentioned, he distinctly recalled going to the synagogue with his parents in the late 30s, and the rabbi did not urge the Jews to leave Germany. The rabbis told people that the Nazi persecution of Jews was a passing phenomenon, and they urged everybody to be law-abiding so they could gain the respect of German Christians, and that they shouldn't worry because God would come to their rescue. So really, your father's parents should not be blamed too severely for misreading the signals that the Nazis were sending, don't you think?
Yeah, I wouldn't blame them. And I think, again, young people can leave more easily, but older people, the idea of leaving behind everything that you've worked for, you're just not that mobile at that age. It's so impossible to see yourself in another place. They were already, nearing 50. And I constantly, being a child of a Holocaust survivor, constantly thinking about how easily I would, and when I would make the decision to up myself. How bad does it have to be?
Now, in 1938, your parents managed to get your father's sister, your Aunt Anita, out of Germany and to England. And when it looked like the only option for the family was to go to China, they convinced your aunt to marry an older Chinese man that they knew, even though she didn't love him. Now, she eventually made it to America and had a very, very rough time. Has she ever written her life story?
I really wish that she had, because that was probably the biggest empty space that I had. My father had written down as much as he knew. about that period of her time. And I think she had a really, really traumatic time, both in leaving the family, in making this terrible marriage to this Chinese man who I know very little about. So everything I wrote as for third-party information. My cousins, her children are alive. They were not able to provide me with more. I wanted to get into her head. I wanted to know more. She's not with us. She died in her 70s, and she was quite older than my father. So now, unfortunately, I'm sure a book could be written as fascinating piece of information. Just the whole interest in going to China. And that almost happened. It was a very close call, but no, unfortunately I don't have more.
Another fascinating aspect of the book is your father's very insightful description of the identity crisis that German Jews felt by 1940. He said, with our German citizenship revoked, the Polish quota we were filling for our US visa, our own country trying to evict us, and being identified as Jews rather than Germans, I did not know who or what I was anymore, and I started to lose track of which side I was on. Audrey, did your dad ever talk to you about the conflicting feelings he and his parents had about going from being proud Germans to being stateless?
When you read that, I got emotional, which is silly. I have read this book a lot of times. I think I'm trying to remember, like, there were some lines that I obviously a lot of the words I've rewritten, and there were some that I left in completely intact. And I think that might have been one of the lines I left completely intact. And there a lot of times when he would talk about, like, when he was being bombed, and they would say, for a lot of people, they felt like the only way they would be saved would be if the Allies would bomb the Germans, right? That's the only way, because, first they would talk about, well, maybe Hitler would be assassinated. They would hope that was it, because now they knew that there was nothing else. And then they thought, well, okay, well, the Allies will come and they'll bomb the Germans. And then they'd be like, wait, we're the Germans. And so there was always this identity crisis that he would talk about in the book. But as how he spoke about it in his adult life to us, that was not something that he expressed. That was really like his reflection as a child. When he was writing his memoirs, he was really back in his childhood. And so and I think, that was the beauty of what he did write, was that he had somehow put himself back in that time. But no, again, as an adult, as I knew him, he had taken on this sort of German identity of, like, oh, we love liverwurst, and and we'd go back to Germany and visit it, and he would show all the spots, and he'd speak German and be excited that he could communicate with people, and he didn't harbor any ill will towards Germans that he spoke of, as a way of, again, sort of like separating himself from the American Jews who were like, we will not buy a German car. We were driving a Beetle, which is strange. It's atypical.
Your dad and his parents arrived in America on September 12th, 1941. He was 11 years old. He wrote that as soon as he arrived in America, he knew he needed to get a new identity and shed his Germanness and his Jewishness as soon as possible. That's a very different attitude than how immigrants feel today, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes. That's really how the title of the book came about, because one of the first things that happened is he went for a school interview and they said, you have to get rid of the name Wolf. You're going to be teased mercilessly for it. And so they offered him a few choices of names, and they said, how about, they said, what's your middle name? And he said, Joachim. And they're like, no, that won't do either. But how about Jacob? It sounds similar. And he was like, no, too Jewish. So he picked Jack, which he thought sounded like nice and American. And so this sort of idea of giving up Wolf was his way of, shedding his German identity and trying to become an American. But again, my interpretation is that he never really quite made it. He wasn't successful really as an American. So at some point he decided, well, I never really, I didn't, his own notes go through a lot of business failures. that I think a lot of times he thought it was because he had a little accent, or he thought it was anti-Semitism. I'm not sure if that was true or that was his interpretation, but I think he always felt like he never really quite made it as an American. And maybe that's why he made that switch and said, well, if they won't accept me, I'll just be the German that I was, But at that time, as a child, as when you're a child, what do you want? To fit in. That's it. And so he made the switch then.
Do you think he ever regretted changing his name to Jack?
I don't. I never got that sense that he did.
Now, you said that he never really felt like he totally fit in as an American. He described his first impressions of the United States as big, bold, and brassy. And he wrote about the culture shock that he and his family experienced. They had a very rough time. Your grandmother got a job in a factory, but your dad said she was a social outcast. Your grandfather fell into a severe depression, and your grandparents became alienated from the few close relatives that they had in America. Why do you think it was so hard for them adjusting to America?
So here's where I think that my grandmother's personality / personality disorder may have played a role. First of all, they moved to Washington Heights, which is very German Jewish, but they didn't move into where all the German Jews were for some reason, and it might have been like economics. They moved to some outskirts where there were no German Jews, and they were living in an area that was very colorfully Italian, Greek, a very lovely working class neighborhood where my father was able to make friends. But they were not situated where they had a community. They did not have community. And that, it's interesting because you mentioned something about immigrants today maintaining their sense of culture. And I can understand how important that is, because if you're not able to speak your language and share your religion with a group of people when you come here, you're very isolated and alone. And my grandmother, she was very judgmental of people, and she had a lot of loyalty tests for people, and she was always feeling like she was this person isn't treating me well, and that person isn't being nice to me. I was a little paranoid about her relationships, and so she was always cutting off ties with people. So the few relatives that she had here, she broke up with. So they were alone. They were just always alone. And my father was a very lonely young man, who's just always searching for friends and friendships. And so I think that just that isolation created much more hardship than there needed to be. That, had they had that community, it just would have been a lot easier.
One of the really heartbreaking things that happened to your dad's father after getting to America is that he was swindled out of $3,000. His death was officially called a heart attack, but there's some suggestion in the book that he committed suicide, correct?
Yes, I think my father, among many things, carried a great deal of guilt over his father's death, because whatever was the cause, my grandfather had suffered from a great deal of depression after being a very, very happy man, a very giddy, delightfully giddy man. When he got here, he was working as a pot washer and then a busboy. He never learned English, and he suffered from the Great Depression, which there is now something that's called Ulysses syndrome, which is like a very distinct type of mental condition that's for immigrants that feel displaced, don't know the language, are homesick. It has its own place in the psychiatric books. And I think that really defines him, because there was this question, could he have had mental illness? Could he have been bipolar? There was this question about, we have a great grandfather Wolf somewhere in the background who supposedly had mental illness, and there was this question, could he have had that? Could it just be emerging? And I think not. I think that this was really an immigrant syndrome of being lost. But the problem was that after this, my grandfather was just trying to see, can he bring his family back? Can he become the man of the house again? Can he make some money again? Can he redeem himself in the eyes of his wife and child? And he got swindled by a known con artist and a famous woman, Bella Dodd, who was actually was she a congresswoman, or she ran for Congress, but she was a famous communist in America who they basically just stole his money. And my grandmother went ape on him, and they all did. The whole family was like, how could you be so stupid? How could you be so stupid? We spent years and years and years pinching pennies to save this money, and you just gave it away. And they berated him so much that no matter how he might have died, they felt responsible. And so that guilt he carried around with him for forever.
Now, I should mention that some of your dad's relatives did not make it out of Germany, and they were never heard from again. Did your dad ever find out what happened to them?
No, that was part of the research that I did, was to, because my father never had internet when he wrote this, and probably not even, I certainly didn't have access to it. And I, through Yad Vashem and the Holocaust Museum, was able to find out what happened to all of those people who simply disappeared, which is also a very strange phenomenon, to have relatives who just disappeared and you have no closure about what happened. So I was able to find out how they passed away, including a beloved friend of his that I wrote about in the book. And I wondered, could I find out what happened to his young friends? And sadly, I did. And it doesn't end well, but it didn't end well for anybody who stayed. Who didn't get out, because they left really on one of the last trains out of Berlin. So yeah, his I think when I wrote it, just the feeling of how many losses he accumulated there, and then even here, on this side, it really struck me how that would also just change him as a human and as a parent. It was very revealing.
Now, another fascinating aspect of the book, Audrey, is that in 1954, at the age of 24, your father was drafted into the army, and he eventually was assigned to a military intelligence unit in Germany. What was it like for him to be back in Germany, this time as an American soldier?
Yeah, I'm sure he had very mixed feelings about it, but I think he was excited to go back. I think that was, as he was preparing to go back, not only was he excited, but his sister, who, was much older, was like, living vicariously through him. And he said, like, everybody wanted to go back. There was a sense that there was this tremendous feeling of homesickness and wanting to like revisit their youth. So that was his thing, is he wasn't going to Berlin, but it was as soon as he had the money for a vehicle that he wanted to see Berlin. And then, of course, when you go back, you can never go home again. It's not what you think it's going to be. It's changed. It's changed dramatically. And it's going to be changed because you're older. But of course, it's changed by war, and it took them a long time to rebuild Berlin, and it's just rubble. But the other part of it was his realization of America and kind of becoming in tune with American propaganda, and understanding that, he didn't even realize that America had spies. Like, he was becoming a spy, and he thought, oh, only Russians have spies. We're a good America. We're the West. So there was a lot of like growing up that he had to do when he went back. And it was a very exciting time for him in becoming a man, so it was, yes, very exciting time.
He worked as a covert intelligence agent, more commonly referred to as a spy, in Eastern Germany, tracking Soviet military activity, weapons capabilities, and defense systems. How did he like the world of surveillance and espionage?
I think he loved it. He absolutely loved it. He felt like he was James Bond. I mean, James Bond had already, had been written. It was, the Ian Fleming books were out, and he was given all this like espionage equipment and tiny little microphones, and wired up his shirt sleeves, and little cameras that were, a few inches. And he thought it was the first time in his life he was cool. I mean, he was a guy, he was bullied most of his American life and childhood, ostracized throughout his early childhood, friendless much of his time. And now all of a sudden he was cool, and he looked cool to the ladies. and he, sort of imagined what it would be like for somebody like him. I mean, it was the highlight of his youth, is to be able to be, you know, as, as close to James Bond as any of us are going to get to be. So no, I think it was very exciting until it suddenly looked dangerous. And then he was like, oh, hello, I'm now, could go to a gulag. This is not as exciting as I thought it was going to be. And so that was a bit of a rude awakening to him, because I think, when you're young, you think you're a little bit, can escape death. And then, he came face to face with reality at some point in the middle. I won't say more.
Your dad wrote that he was sometimes offended by the anti-German sentiment that Americans expressed after the war. I was really surprised by that, because I would have thought that he too would have had anti-German sentiments after the war, but he didn't, did he?
Well, again, that was his identity. This was the whole thing, about the book, is it's an identity piece too, of who are you? And you're a little bit of everything, right? You're Jewish, you're German, you're American, you're a little bit of anything. But if somebody says, if you're born German, and then somebody says, we hate those Germans, what does that say about you? So I don't think he ever was comfortable with anything. And, I'm not sure there's any resolution to the answer to this question. I think he tried on different things. He tried on being American, it didn't quite stick. He tried on being a German, people didn't like that either. I think he was in conflict about his Jewishness, which I would imagine that would be an easy thing to do if you're persecuted for it. So I fault him not at all for the identity confusion.
I want to ask you about the role of destiny in all this. This is really what struck me the most about the book. Just look at this series of events. On November 10th, 1938, when Kristallnacht happened, your grandfather and great-uncle Siegfried were miraculously saved from being arrested and sent to a concentration camp. On July 12th, 1941, your father and his parents made it out of Germany on the last passenger train headed west. They managed to get on one of the last cargo ships to cross the Atlantic, even though their visas to the US had expired. And they miraculously got their visas extended at the very last minute, when they were about to be ejected from the ship. Did your dad believe in destiny?
I think my father believed in God. However, his daughter is a card-carrying atheist. I do. I think my father had I think he believed in God. I think that's what he believed in. That's about as much as I can say about it.
Well, talking about destiny and the many miracles that happened in your dad's life, I was amazed to read that in the late 30s, your grandparents sent some jewelry to total strangers in Holland for safekeeping during the war. And in 1946, they actually got the jewelry back. Isn't that amazing?
Yes, there are a lot of amazing things in his story. I mean, really, truly amazing things that's why I wrote the book, because it is an amazing story. Although I will say also that people who survived, they have amazing stories. I mean, I've read others' survival stories, and it's amazing, whether people got help from other people or whether they hid in plain sight or whatever they did. I mean, the stories are truly amazing. It was a horrible time, and it required either great persistence or guile or luck or serendipity or whatever you want to call it. But in any case, the jewelry was, they handed it off to strangers. It was a cousin who said, I work with a Red Cross worker who goes back and forth to Holland. She's smuggling. And again, my grandmother, who trusts nobody, says, why would we give our jewelry to a stranger? And she's like, well, otherwise you're going to have to turn it in. This is a better choice, take your chances. And they did. And they had some kind of a code name for somebody. And my grandmother's reading the Aufbau, which is like a German newspaper for, diaspora Jews. And she sees an ad with this code name. I don't know what the code name is. I never knew. And it says, looking for people, looking for somebody, looking for people, friends and family. And she calls the number and they say, describe the jewelry to us. And she describes it, and yeah, they get it. It was nothing much. There's very little monetary value, but it's her father's watch chain, a little, just, very little, but the fact that could happen was just so incredible.
It's one of many, many fascinating and amazing things in the book. I want to tell our viewers that you can learn more about Audrey Birnbaum by going to her website, AudreyBirnbaumAuthor.com. And you can also follow her on Facebook and Instagram. Well, Audrey, I want to say to you that I think one of the reasons this book is so important is because many people assume that the Jews who were lucky enough to get out of Europe and escape the Holocaust didn't suffer. Yes, they were definitely the lucky ones, but they did suffer the trauma of persecution, deprivation, the death of their family members who couldn't get out of Europe, and the enormous challenges of building a new life in America. Your dad and his family were definitely traumatized, and he wrote that he passed his anxieties down to you and to your sister. How were you affected by that?
So, he didn't write that, I did. So I'm not sure that he was aware that he did, but I think that he, as a parent, was full of fear. There was a constant fear that everything could be taken away at any time. He was afraid of happiness because, even good things, you'd think, well, when is the shoe going to drop? The other shoe going to drop. And I think he also had tremendous survivor guilt too, because all the losses he had suffered, and I think he parented that way. And so I think my sister and I feel the effects of that greatly, but I'm not sure that he was aware of how he was affected and how that impacted the family, but it did impact us greatly. But no, those were the author's words.
So Audrey, now that this book is out, do you have any plans to write another book?
Harvey, yes, I do. I started writing a book a few months ago. It is entirely fictional. It's still insightful about human nature, because I do find that very interesting, but it is much more, fun. It's a group of people on vacation together from multiple walks of life. However, there is another book to be written that has to do with, I used to, when I was working in my profession, I used to tell my colleagues stories about my life growing up, and they used to say to me, "Audrey, you really should write a book about that." And I think one day I will. I have kept those not part of this discussion, but my childhood could be a book unto itself. So we'll save that for another day, another book.
Well, there are a number of books written by children of survivors. We've had several of them on our show. And so I hope that when you do release that book, that you'll come back on our show to promote it.
It would be my pleasure.
Well, Audrey, thank you so much for writing this beautiful and important book, which not only adds to the historical record of the Holocaust, but it also immortalizes your father and his family. So thank you for doing that. And thank you so much for taking the time to appear on our show.
Thank you, Harvey. Thank you so much.
Our guest has been Audrey Birnbaum, whose book entitled American Wolf, From Nazi Refugee to American Spy is now available on Amazon and wherever books are sold. My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you to my producer, Steve Silver, my director of programming, Deborah Batsafin, my production assistant, Rosa Puzo, and my entire team at the XPTV1 network in the UK. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out all the great interviews on the Harvey Brownstone Interviews YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when new videos are posted.